Caroline, thank you very much indeed. Time now is 25 to 9. What is the UN for? This question was perhaps easier to answer in 1945 when, out of the ashes of not one but two world wars, an institution led by Western allies was created to embody something like the collective will of nations and to provide diplomatic, humanitarian and military muscle that might prevent the recent horrors, as it then was in 1945, from being repeated. Next week, it's the UN General Assembly. Next month, the UN turns 80. It is a vast organisation whose work is felt in every corner of the globe. But in an era of national populism and the senescence of that Western alliance, the question is not so much what has the UN ever done for us, but what can and should it still do in a world both on fire and in flux. Well, Martin Griffiths is a former UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, and he wrote in The Guardian earlier this week, the UN is in crisis, this great institution is desperately short of funding, and more importantly, relevance. Let's chat to him. Martin, good morning.
Good morning, Amal. How are you doing?
Well, good. Always a pleasure to have you on and speak to you about, not least about some subjects that you've spent 50 years working on and thinking about and acting in. Why do you say that the UN is in crisis, Martin?
Well, of course, it's partly in crisis, as you said, because of funding. I mean, it's not just the funding for projects in the field for humanitarian funding and others, but because of the core funding that the US owes, I think, over 2.5 billion at the moment already and is threatening to reduce further. Secondly, it's in crisis because, as you described, so many of those instruments that were set up are not being used. And I think I mentioned in that Guardian piece that the only unforgivable sin is inaction. And I see it particularly in the business of peacemaking, of mediation and peacemaking. But we also see it in the issue of peacekeeping, as you know. So it is in crisis. And my view is the way out of crisis is to be less risk averse, to take more risks, to do more, to achieve relevance.
How do you do that? What are those risks? What should they be doing right now that they're not doing to keep that relevance?
Well, in my view, and I'm involved myself since we last spoke in the business of peacemaking, but independently, of course, there should be much more presence and action of UN initiatives, officials, special envoys, and so forth in many of the places that are going down hard. You know, look at Sudan. I've been looking carefully at Sudan. It hasn't got an exit strategy. There is one apparently on somebody's table, and I would normally like to see the UN taking the lead on that, as they do, incidentally, on humanitarian issues, obviously key to all these crises, but not on others. The UN was unable to play a significant peacemaking role in Gaza because of its strong and stern messages of condemnation. It's not really active in Afghanistan, not so much either in South Sudan, and so on and so forth. So we don't see the UN leading peace processes. That's the bottom line.
And is the problem then, I mean, it's interesting what you say about Gaza. There are those who would argue, and perhaps you disagree with them, that it's a bad place for the UN to be, where having taken a strong political view and having asserted a position, it's unable to do its humanitarian work. Is the problem, therefore, that the UN has been too, as it were, politicised, even when its job is obviously central to the world of politics?
Well, it was ever thus, I think. The UN was set up, as you were saying at the top, that as an organization for international peace and security. We know that the Security Council is unable to do that job, and that was created for them to do. But you can't avoid, I know it costs directly, you can't avoid condemning crimes and highlighting tragedies. That's its purpose. The fact is that you can do that judiciously, with the right people talking at the right time and not others, and not lose the potential mandate to do good. And most humanitarian agencies that I used to work with constantly say, where is the UN for peacemaking? So it would help us as well as the people that we serve.
What does the UN, what's the need for the UN? What does the UN do, Martin, that national governments can't do?
Well, as you know, I was involved in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was something that Antonio Guterres led. And what we found in that was number one, a breadth of skills. We created a team of about 12 people, not, significantly not too many people from across the system and from outside. And they brought skills in from World Food Programme, from the International Maritime Organization, from mediation, and so on and so forth, and me from OCHA. And it worked. It worked precisely, I think, because we had the leverage of the world and the hosting of Turkey, but we also had the skills to apply in a very neutral fashion. So what it brings, well, I think, is neutrality, a sense of disinterestedness. We don't bring interest. Member states always do, understandably, and thus also a sense of legitimization.
But what about this idea that it was essentially a response to historical circumstances that have passed, Martin? It's interesting listening to the asylum debate in this country that there is this view that actually some Labour politicians are now expressing, which is that we have a system of laws or regulations around the whole issue of refugees and asylum, which were born of that post-war moment. And that's now 80 years ago. What of the argument that the UN, if it's to sustain relevance, has to find a modern role which is rather fundamentally different to the kind of moment in which it was born?
Well, I think that must be true, Amal, and I think it must be true because, yes, we live in a world almost as subject to instability and tragedy and insecurity as 80 years ago, but different in different ways. And this is particularly true when you look at the demise of peacekeeping and we look at the new challenges of humanitarian effort, never mind peacemaking. We've got to reinvent it. We have to reinvent the precise role of the UN. Now, I think that's essential. I think that's possible. I don't think it's closely being done at the moment. The member states of the UN, on the whole, are not keen for this reimagining, for this new vision. I believe, and I'm sure this must be true, that you can't cut or reform the UN without looking at the new role and vision. And there are discussions about becoming more local, but it's absolutely essential now.
Martin Griffiths, thank you very much indeed.
It is 18 minutes.